prisoner, with the Royal Navy taking additional losses during the evacuation. Although the mission was a success for Hitler, he had sustained such heavy losses during the invasion, with men being shot down in the sky, that Germany's parachute regiment would not be used again in a major battle for the remainder of the war. While this was a major victory for the Axis powers, it was the first of several times that Mussolini's failures would require Hitler to divert his soldiers to the Mediterranean. This would in time prove to be disastrous for the Führer, as his forces became stretched thin. Having chosen the path of conquest, Japan now looked to the Dutch East Indies and other countries in the Pacific Theatre, countries that would provide them with oil and rubber. But for this plan to work, the Japanese believed that American influence in the region would have to be removed. In other words, Japan's leaders decided that military expansion in Southeast Asia would require an attack on the United States. As the US had recently put their entire Pacific fleet within striking distance of Japanese forces, Pearl Harbor would become Japan's main target. The attack on Pearl Harbor was masterminded by Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. A gifted naval officer, Yamamoto was reluctant to go to war with the United States, but when war became an inevitability, he knew that the only way for Japan to win was to knock out America's Pacific Fleet before the fighting began. If they couldn't do so, Yamamoto thought that Japan would eventually lose in a prolonged conflict with the United States. Yamamoto believed the attack on Pearl Harbor would give Japan time, around 6 months, to seize the Dutch East Indies and secure control of Southeast Asia and the Western Pacific without American interference. During this time, Japan could also begin construction of new battleships and aircraft carriers, increasing its presence and naval might in the region. And lastly, Yamamoto's plan assumed that the United States would negotiate peace terms following the loss of its fleet, seeking compromise and accepting Japanese dominance in East Asia. Yamamoto also believed that it was vital to destroy America's aircraft carriers in the attack, as he saw them as being the true heart of a modern navy, as opposed to battleships. But unknown to Yamamoto, US codebreakers had managed to crack the Japanese diplomatic code and knew an attack was imminent, but they didn't know where. With American territory under threat, most at the time thought the Philippines was the most likely target. So when the US command of Pearl Harbor was warned that Japan was on the offensive, all they could do was prepare to mobilize against a threat they thought would strike somewhere in the Pacific, never imagining that they would be the actual target. As a result, Walter Short, the army commander in Hawaii, believed that the most serious threat Pearl Harbor faced was sabotage from the 160,000 Hawaiian residents of Japanese ancestry. The island's planes were then clustered together on the runways so that they could be closely guarded, and military supplies such as anti-aircraft rounds were locked away to prevent sabotage. To reinforce the security of American outposts, 2 of the 3 aircraft carriers were sent from Pearl Harbor to Wake and Midway Island, with the 3rd aircraft carrier undergoing maintenance back on the west coast of the United States. The Japanese forces attacked Pearl Harbor on the morning of December 7, 1941. The attackers achieved complete surprise, with almost every American who looked up to the sky and saw the Japanese planes, assuming they were friendly aircraft engaged in training exercises. But then the first bombs exploded. Torpedoes specially designed for shallow waters struck into the side of battleships, while armor-piercing bombs rained down from above, cutting through their decks. Within minutes, the battleships Maryland and Tennessee were each hit, followed by the Arizona, which sank almost instantly. The first Japanese wave consisted of 183 planes, with torpedo bombers attacking the ships and dive bombers simultaneously attacking the airfields, preventing airborne resistance. But unfortunately for the Americans, Their anti-sabotage operation had left their planes clustered together, making them ideal targets for Japanese bombs. To make matters worse, they couldn't even shoot back, as their anti-aircraft ammunition had been locked away. 90 minutes later, the attack was over. The Japanese had sunk or damaged 19 ships and destroyed 188 planes, while damaging 159 others. The attack had killed over 2,000 US servicemen, with nearly half of them on the US battleship Arizona. It appeared to be a total victory for Japan, who had lost only 29 aircraft during the assault. Believing sufficient damage had been done, Admiral Nagumo, who had commanded the operation, called off a third attack. However, although Japanese losses were minuscule, victory was not complete. 3 American aircraft carriers were not at Pearl Harbor, and 7 heavy cruisers were still out at sea. The attack had also failed to hit American fuel depots and had not destroyed the US submarine base. The next day, President Franklin Roosevelt declared war on the Japanese Empire, and 3 days later, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States. Pearl Harbor would rally the American people, who were once isolationists, into fierce defenders of liberty, with Americans from all over the United States flocking to recruitment stations. Far from wiping out American influence in the Pacific, the Japanese had just awoken a sleeping giant. What had started as a mainly European war had now escalated into a global conflict. In the wake of victory at Pearl Harbor, and thinking that the American fleet had been neutralized, Japan embarked on a devastating path of conquest across Southeast Asia and the Pacific. Within a month, Japan had attacked Thailand, British Hong Kong, Malaya, Burma and Borneo, as well as the American Philippines, Guam and Wake Island. A month later, Japan invaded the Dutch East Indies, New Guinea and the Solomon Islands, and a month after that, they invaded Singapore, the crown jewel of British imperial rule in the East. The British had fortified Singapore with coastal defence guns, pointing out towards the sea, but Japan were invading from the north, by land and by air. With 30,000 Japanese soldiers attacking on foot through Malaya, the British seemed to be in good position as they spotted 85,000 soldiers in the region, comprising of both British, Australian and Indian troops. But the British were outmatched in air power by a factor of 2 to 1, with the Japanese also having both newer and more advanced tanks and aircraft. With Britain and the rest of Europe focusing on Germany in the west, little to no modern weaponry was prioritised for the east. And so with only 30,000 troops, less than a third of British forces, the Japanese quickly broke through the British defensive lines in the north, forcing a retreat back to Singapore itself. In response, Britain sent 2 battleships in support, HMS Prince of Wales and HMS Repulse, but they were sent without the aid of an aircraft carrier, making the ships vulnerable from the sky. As a result, they were quickly destroyed by Japanese dive bombers, giving Japan naval superiority in Southeast Asia. As Churchill noted at the time, over all this vast expanse of waters, Japan was supreme, and we everywhere were weak and naked. Japan then pushed into Singapore, and after a devastating series of bombing raids by Japanese aircraft, the British garrison was left completely overwhelmed. After a week of fighting, military supplies and rations were running low, with petrol for military vehicles and ammunition for the field artillery and anti-aircraft guns almost completely gone. As a result, the commanding officer, Lieutenant General Arthur Percival, initiated the largest surrender in British military history, with 80,000 troops laying down their arms. Allied soldiers were then taken to Japanese prisoner of war camps, being used as slave labour. More than half of those taken would never return home. Burma and the Dutch East Indies fell the next month, and with Britain having been pushed out of Southeast Asia, Its position in India was now threatened. 200 years of British supremacy in the East had been brought to an end in a matter of months. In a mere 6 months, Japan had wiped out most of the Allied presence in the Far East, with their conquest of the Pacific almost complete. But as Japan had attacked the US territories of Pearl Harbor, the Philippines, as well as Guam and Wake Island, the United States were looking for revenge, and so Roosevelt looked for a way to strike back against the Japanese in an attempt to boost morale